my newest textbook. It's called The Handbook on the Legislative Process in California. It's 680 or so pages with over 200 chapters in it. You know, when I first wrote a book on the California legislative process, that textbook is called Understanding the California Legislative Process. It took me a couple of years to put it together. It was published in early 2020, and frankly, I thought I had covered most of the topics. But over the last few years, I've definitely come across a number of different aspects of the legislative process and lawmaking generally in California that I thought needed to be covered and that I hadn't covered in my first textbook. So 220 chapters. Hopefully this handbook will serve as a real beneficial textbook for those who are involved or interested in the legislative process in California. It's definitely one of a kind book. I talk first about the legislature and its authority. Then I get in depth about the legislative process, everything from floor and committee procedures and publications to other provisions. After an introduction, part one is on the legislature's power and its role as an institution. That's in chapters 1 through 27. Part two of the book begins a discussion of the legislative process here in California. It's covered in chapters 28 to 59. Part three covers committee procedures, including bill referrals in chapters 60 through 90. Part four of the book deals with floor procedures in chapters 91 through 125. Part five of the textbook is on legislative publications and resources. That's in chapters 126 to 138. Then in part six of the handbook, I turn to ethics in the legislative process, and I have chapters 139 to 148 on those topics. I deal briefly in part seven with some influences on the legislative process in chapters 149 to 152. Part eight deals with legislative advocacy, chapters 153 to 168. Part nine, I turn to drafting and analyzing bills, which are covered in chapters 169 to 194. In part 10 of the handbook, I cover statutory interpretation and legislative intent, and do so in chapters 195 through 203. Part 11 deals with the executive branch's role in the legislative process, and here I discuss it in chapters 204 to 216. Part 12 deals with direct democracy and its role in the legislative process in chapters 217 and 218. Part 13 of the textbook deals with the California budget process in chapters 219 to 229. And finally, part 14 of my handbooks deals with legislative process misconceptions and proposals for reform. Those are covered in chapters 230 and 231 of this handbook.